Today we're going to talk about Buick's luxurious little senior compact for 1962, the Skylark or Skylark Special. Now, the Skylark was introduced as a nameplate on the senior compact for the 1961 model year, partway through the 1961 model year, as an up-level vehicle and only as a two-door coupe. But for 1962, it actually became a standalone model as opposed to just a trim like it was in 1961. And it also added a convertible to the lineup. So 1962 was really the birth of the true Skylark. And yes, the name had been used in the 1950s briefly on a Roadmaster convertible. But this was really the beginning of, I'll call it the true Skylarks in the Buick sense. And the name was used for many, many years subsequently. Now, I did mention that the Skylark was a so-called senior compact. It was introduced in 1961 alongside General Motors' other senior compacts, the Pontiac Tempest, the Oldsmobile F85, and then the Buick Special. And then, as I mentioned, the Skylark was a trim partway through the model year on the Special before becoming its own model in 1962. And the reason they were called senior compacts is that they were a little bit larger than the compact that preceded these three, the Corvair, which was introduced for the 1960 model year. And just for reference, the Corvair was about 180 inches long, and the Skylark, as well as the Tempest and the Oldsmobile F85, were about 188 inches long. So they had about 8 inches more length to them than the Corvair. And of course, if for whatever reason General Motors had to put such different engines and transmissions in all of their senior compacts, the Corvair, of course, with its air-cooled flat six-cylinder engine. Then you had the Pontiac Tempest that had a standard half of a 389 V8 trophy four-cylinder engine under hood. Then in the F85 as well as the Special for 1961, you had a standard 215 cubic inch aluminum block V8 engine. By the way, this aluminum block was later sold to Rover, where it was very popular all the way into the early aughts of the 21st century, and became a, kind of like the Chevy 350, if you will, overseas. And then for 1962, Buick not only had the standard aluminum 215 cubic inch V8 in the Skylark version of the vehicle, and in fact, the Skylark came with 190 horsepower, four-barrel, 215 cubic inch V8. The standard, or I should say the standard, the one level down was a two-barrel, 215 cubic inch V8, and then the standard engine was a Fireball V6 that made 135 horsepower. This was really a V6 that was made out of cast iron, derived off of the same architecture as the 215 cubic inch V8, but was introduced for reasons of cost and to try to get the price on the Buick Special lower. And hence it was made out of cast iron being the cheaper material to manufacture engine blocks out of. And of course, that would later become the famous Buick 3.8 and beginning in 1988, the Buick 3800, which, by the way, interestingly, General Motors ended up selling the tooling for this V6 and then bought it back subsequently from Kaiser Jeep when it was determined that it was no longer needed by them and GM needed something to help them with fuel economy. So they ended up selling it actually to Kaiser Jeep and then bought it back from AMC as AMC had acquired the Jeep brand from Kaiser subsequently. And let's take a little closer look at this 1962 Buick Skylark, this beautiful burgundy, that's the actual name of the color, Special with the white top. I think it's a stunning car and a stunning color combination. Now, a couple interesting things about the Special and its senior compact cousins. First of all, they shared the A-pillars, the front windshield, the front side door glass, that little vent pane there, roof panels, a lot of sheet metal, and even the doors. So take a look at this door and notice how sculptural it is. It has this extremely large shoulder. Notice how far inset the door glass is from the door handle. And then you have this basically sculpted body side that creates a low light underneath that shoulder to give it some more visual appeal. And again, it's just something totally different from what you see today where the body sides are just completely flat. This kind of almost has the Continental style roofline, similar to the 1961 Continental, where that glass plane is inset significantly from the outer edge of the door. But the reason I point out the sculpture of the door is shared across the Tempest as well as the F-85 and the Skylark. And that had to be tough for designers because this wasn't just kind of a standard door that looked generic. It really had a lot of sculpture to it. But the designers did a masterful job blending it in to the front and the rear, and these cars all look different. The Skylark has these kind of pointy fenders up front, which neither the F-85 nor the Tempest have. Of course, the Tempest would get Pontiac's signature split grille during this particular time frame. And instead, the Skylark would get the same look that was shared with the full-size Buicks up front with those pointy, I guess you can call them kind of rocket-nosed fenders. It almost looks like a rocket form that continues down the body side of the car, inclusive of the 3 ventiports that are on the side. One thing I don't necessarily care for is that theme tends to work better on the larger cars that have more width. But here, because it pushes the headlamps inboard, kind of makes the front end look a little bit more narrow, and you notice the grille isn't all that wide, although the designers are trying to emphasize the horizontal dimension of the car with that very linear grille in the middle. Now, as we rotate along to the body side, we can see a couple other things here, one of which is just how beautiful this roofline is. And it's a tall roofline as well. It's not necessarily one with a low roof. Look at how big the windshield is in these cars. That was one of the great things, is they really had this feeling of openness and airiness, particularly depending upon which one you got. If you got the Tempest, that not only had the strange half of a 389 V8, the Trophy 4 under hood, it also had the so-called rope drive and then the rear transaxle, so it had an even flatter floor than the Skylark and F-85. But I think that the overall look of this car is just beautiful. I love that shoulder, how it continues on the back and forms the top of the deck lid, and the sculpture continues from the door rearward as well. One other thing to note about these, the side glass is not curved. It's just straight up and down, so Buick saved a lot of money there. Curved side glass was introduced on American cars with the 1957 Imperial, but by this point it was starting to trickle down to other vehicles, but not here for the Skylark. And here you see the Squircle-style wheel arches that Buick, I don't want to say borrowed from Cadillac because they look different on this, and relatively muted. Of course, you've got that sculptural area above the wheel arches, so you don't necessarily need to have a big wheel arch, and in fact, it would interfere with the look on the rest of the car. But take a look at that roof, and I love how it looks like it's just floating on the body. Definitively a 3-box design. I love that very tight crease that runs along the top, and you can see it there on the top of the C-pillar and how it's got that kind of kink in the middle, midway through the C-pillar. And that C-pillar has similarly interesting surfacing. You can see how the light's breaking on it. It's just a kind of an interesting roof style that you didn't really see on other cars of the era. I also love the trim, the bright work on the rear quarter panel. It kind of wraps around, as we'll see, into the deck lid with a picture of another car. And here's a little close-up of that C-pillar, and you can see that crease that I was mentioning at the upper portion of it, and kind of how that crease intersects at a 90-degree angle at the top of the C-pillar, as well as the radius of the C-pillar. Just an interesting shape and kind of atypical for the time period. Here's a lovely shot of a Skylark convertible, and you can see that rear trim, how it starts at the quarter panel, the bright work, and then wraps around the entire rear end, encompassing the tail lights. Just a beautiful detail. And I love also how the deck lid and the tops of the quarter panels and the shoulder that I was talking about on the door and even the hood, it basically all forms one plane, one flat plane. And it looks fantastic, especially on this convertible. The surfacing and detail on this little Skylark, I think, is just absolutely superb. And it's certainly something that I really enjoy these vehicles, despite the fact that they really don't have all that much collectability for some reasons that we're going to go into in a minute as we talk about the interior and the underhood features. Now, as we flip to the inside, you'll notice buttons everywhere on this Skylark and I guess a mauve interior. I don't know what kind of color you'd call that, but I think it's attractive. It looks good. Lots of buttons. Look at the door panel, how many buttons you have there. Buttons and biscuits all over the place. Somebody was taking inspiration from, I think, a Chevrolet Monza show car from the earlier 1960s for the Skylark. And one way to jazz up interiors in the 1960s and 1970s, if you had no other way to do so, is add buttons and add biscuit pleating. That was kind of a universal maxim, I think. But the Skylark also had this very mid-century modern-esque dash with that little cluster, that's such a little attractive cluster that protrudes from the instrument panel, a little piece of bright work underneath the speedometer where the idiot lights are encompassed. Just a fantastic little interior. And you notice that the floor is relatively flat here. It's got to accommodate the dual pitch transmission or the roto-hydromatic in the Oldsmobile F85. So it's not completely flat, but definitely had some room in these. Here's another view from the passenger side of the interior, and not really much of a crash pad in front of the passenger there. So hopefully you don't get in an accident. Of course, this was during a time frame when seatbelts also weren't very popular in cars, and many cars weren't even equipped with them. In fact, my 1965 Pontiacs have no seatbelts in the rear, only seatbelts in the front seat. I won't tell my wife about that when I had to put my son in the back seat at one point in time, and there was no seatbelt, but she'll probably watch this and find out. It's fine. Oh, well. And here's a little up-close picture of that speedometer. Beautiful little instrument pod. You got the HVAC off to the left of the instrument pad, the radio off to the right. Notice the shift quadrant, PNDLR. Well, this was before the shift quadrants were standardized, and the roto-hydromatics, the dual-pitch transmission like you have in this particular vehicle, and the old-school hydromatic as well had a PND, sometimes SLR, shift quadrant where reverse was at the bottom. And the old hydromatics, in fact, you would put the car into reverse and shut the key off, and that was how the park pawl engaged before it even had a P. So it would soon be a standardized shift quadrant, but they hadn't gotten there yet. One other detail on the Skylarks is that you got color matching brake pedals and accelerator pedals. Although interestingly, the brackets that form the support for the brake and the accelerator are not color keyed. You'd think they would have painted them as well and just gone all the way, but something that gave you a little touch of luxury. You had to have the matching rubber pedals in your car to complement the carpet and the interiors appropriately. I previously mentioned the underhood area. This is the 215 cubic inch aluminum block V8 that in the Skylarks made a standard 190 horsepower, is high compression, topped by a 4-barrel carburetor. And the engines here, they were decently reliable. They did have some issues associated with them. I think that was one of the contributors to their early demise. And then, unfortunately, many of these senior compacts just didn't have great transmissions that held up. The Tempest torque, I think it was called for the Pontiac Tempest, the rear-mounted transaxle, not good. By the way, that had an exposed torque converter, so you could look underneath the car and watch the torque converter spin as the engine was running. And then the roto-hydromatic in the Oldsmobile, the dual pitch in the Buick was, I think, halfway decent. But the roto-hydromatic and the Tempest torque automatic were definitely not very good. Might have best opted for, in the Skylark, you could get a standard 3-speed synchronized manual, an optional 4-speed manual. Probably would have picked one of those, and then you wouldn't have had as many issues. But the aluminum block V8, like I said, was okay, but Rover really perfected it when General Motors sold it to Rover, as many customers in the mid-1960s were not looking for small, lightweight, efficient engines. Remember, these senior compacts were planned in the middle of the late 1950s recession, when it was thought that customers were going to be really motivated to buy cars that got good fuel economy and they didn't want to spend a lot on vehicles. And then the halcyon days of the mid-60s hit, and customers wanted cars with big V8s and big dimensions and not these little senior compacts. So they didn't last very long. They were unibody as well, so they did have some rust issues. I have to say, if you drive one of these, they have some of the most comfortable rides of any car I've ever ridden in. Despite the fact that they're unibody, they are shockingly comfortable. I mean, shockingly comfortable and very peppy. The little 215 V8, I've only driven one that it was an Oldsmobile F85, my friend's Oldsmobile F85, that has the standard 2-barrel low compression, and it's very peppy. I can only imagine what the high compression V8 feels like with the 4-barrel carburetor on top. although perhaps the dual pitch transmission slows it a little bit, just because that's what Buick was employing during this time frame in these. At least if nothing else, I suppose you've got some spare washer fluid there with the OptiClean bottle that you can see on the driver's side, something that you really just don't see anymore. Having some spare washer fluid. Of course, the washer fluid reservoirs now can hold like 5 gallons of fluid, as opposed to back in the day here where they really didn't hold all that much, because it was expected that people would pop their hood and refill it. Now nobody ever pops their hood, so got to make the washer fluid jug large enough such that it can survive in between oil changes. In any case, what do you think of this handsome little 62 Skylark? I think it's a stunning little car, particularly in this color combination. But drop a line in the comments and let me know your thoughts. Thanks again for watching.